Okay, another really interesting thing of the history on this is that you cite this guy named Walzer, who argues that there were three successful secular revolutions: Israel, India, and Algeria. But within like a couple decades, they changed from being a secular revolution to more of a fundamentalist religious mindset or worldview.
Yeah.
And I want to ask you about that, how that happened in Israel, since Israel is in the news these days.
Yeah. Israel, founded out of the ashes of the Holocaust, though there had been folks gradually moving into the old land of Israel for decades, beginning for a long time, but especially beginning in the late 19th century. But the founders of the modern state of Israel were, they were secular for the most part. They were labor oriented. They were essentially socialist Zionists.
Okay.
They wanted a homeland for the Jewish people. They believed that the traditional Jewish religiosity was not helpful for a modern state, and they wanted to kind of bracket it and not have it be central to the state. So Walzer, who is Jewish, says that the original founders from 1948 were secular Zionist revolutionaries, you might say, and they built a country. This was the Labor Party.
Was this Ben Gurion and
that era? That's right. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
But that developments after 1967 and 1973, the two wars, among other things, when Israel defeated its adversaries in 67 and occupied Palestinian territory that had been set aside for a Palestinian state, and then began settling it with hundreds of thousands of settlers. It took, Walzer says, it took generally a certain kind of person to want to go where they weren't really wanted, and to even do things that generally are understood to be against international law. And so he talks about the kind of tough settler, the settler folks who went into the occupied territories. And some of these were secular folks, but a lot of them were religious Zionists. They were Jewish religious Zionists. They believed that taking the whole of the land between the Jordan and the Mediterranean was Israel's birthright from God. So from 1967 forward and accelerating gradually in the decades, more and more of the population of Israel has become either ultra-Orthodox or kind of settler militant.
Okay.
But there's also plenty of people who have the older vision, who are secular or who are more, they're not really militant in that way. They want peace with the Palestinians. And so Israel has been a very divided society for a while. And that was what the news was coming out of Israel before recent events, right? The protests in the streets over what Netanyahu's government was doing.
Right.
So one might say that Netanyahu and his cabinet in this last round represented a kind of authoritarian, reactionary Judaism or Jewish vision.
Right. Yeah. Right? Yeah. Because he went really far to the right, and he apparently brought on some questionable characters into his government.
For sure.
Outright bigots, etc.
Right. Yeah. So that helps us understand what's happening now, because that kind of cabinet has had people in it who have been, I think, intentionally provocative and inflammatory of Palestinian sensitivities.
Okay.
In the West Bank, and also at in the very sensitive area around the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem.
Right. Yeah. So those things really had an impact, and this was just in the last, I think, since last the first of the year, right? That
like thousands of people going to the area up on the Temple Mount that was understood to be reserved for Muslims. If you visit Jerusalem, as I have a couple times, there's an area for the Jewish community at the bottom of that wall, and an area for the Muslim community at the top of the Temple Mount, where the Al-Aqsa Mosque is. And it's a very sensitive area, and the way peace is kept is everybody stays in their spot. But there have been people in this cabinet who have been kind of parading up there just to you might say, to create a provocation.
Right, right. Now that's yeah. That's very interesting and you know, concerning when you hear something like that. I mean, so all right, what about how does Christian Zionism play into this? Because
Yeah.
obviously all of a sudden not only are there Jewish people who are more settler motivated or religious, have some religious overtones. But the Christian right in the U.S. especially has just dove in and supported Israel for their own reasons. So what about that?
It's an awful example of Christians doing some really questionable theology and having some really disastrous political consequences. Basically, the backstory here is, at a broad level, Christian sense of identification with the Holy Land because of reading the Bible all these years, right? We know all these locations, and we have a sense of oh, this is precious territory, this is Holy
Right,
Land, right?
right.
But then you also have the people who read the founding of the modern state of Israel in apocalyptic terms as ushering in the events of the last days.
Hmm.
Um, and most of those folks uh, have also believed that, or acted as if, Israel reclaiming all of the territory of their historic homeland between the Jordan and the Mediterranean, the biggest extent, is part of God's will. In other words, Palestinians have been invisible in this story. They don't
Right,
matter.
right. Yeah,
So a
it's
very
part of
powerful,
prophecy, prophetic
that's right, all that.
words are being fulfilled in this Israel
Yes,
coming and creating a new nation. Yeah.
that's right. And so the idea that Palestinians would share that Holy Land just didn't compute. It wasn't part of the story. So now the fact that the end of this story for most Christian Zionists is Jesus comes back on the Mount of Olives and everybody
Right.
converts.
Right. Yeah.
That's a little inconvenient, but the impact of it is, many Christian Zionists who are reading this story have been very hard line in support of very hardline Israeli policies. It's like they're living in a mythic apocalyptic world, but the policy implications of living in that world are really bad for the people who live in the actual territory right now.
Right. Yeah. No, it's amazing. I think the phrase that comes to me in these situations is the ends justifies the means. So you've got people who claim to follow Jesus in this case, who taught us to love our enemies. But because this is part of the prophetic will of God, well, and this is going to, usher in the return of Christ. Well, we can do these things, these other things that are, more hardline and more retributive because of that. I mean, maybe they don't say that out loud or think that, but that seems to be what's going on.
I would say ends justify the means thinking is growing in the part of the Christian community that we're talking about here. I
Yeah,
mean, and not
right,
just there, not just on this issue.
right. So, all right, since we have this Israel-Hamas, this terrible war going on with Israel and Hamas, and you're a Christian ethicist, so what are your thoughts on a Christian response to this war?
Christians should be on the side of peace and freedom and dignity and justice for every human being and every
Hmm.
group.
Yep.
Um, the original UN plan was that uh, the new state of Israel and a Palestinian state would share that territory. That in the land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. We should still have that dream. How to negotiate the exact territorial um, contours is a matter for the diplomats, but um, there have been a lot of missed opportunities to make peace. Some really near misses.
Yeah.
Um, I would say a long history of violence and counter violence, of insult and counter insult and growing hatred. And the radicalization of a part of both populations, Palestinian and Israeli, is a fact. And I would say that Hamas represents an especially radicalized vision that committed atrocious mass murder and every other kind of war crime a couple weeks ago. And that those crimes should be named for what they are, absolute atrocities that can have no justification. But that if the answer by Israel is to bulldoze Gaza under rubble without sufficient care for the well-being of civilians, that is also not okay.
Right.
So we need to be supporting peace and dignity and justice for all, and listening to the peacemakers who are already on the ground on both sides, who have relationships, who are trying to help people dig out from their radicalization and move in a more constructive direction. And that's what we should be pushing for.
Right. Yeah, it's very sad. I mean, it just seems like there's a war crime happens, and then the response is another war crime, and it's just it's been going on like this for so many years. But it's very complex political situation, and I think just having this kind of conversation about the background and the historical events that happened that led to this really helps people to understand it and also come up with a better way to respond to it rather than just a retributive way.
Right. Yeah. And just kind of being loyal to one side is not adequate. I mean, even just in terms of Christian ethics, because of the value and worth of all people. Right.
Right. Yes. Right. And yeah. And you can find a way to be loyal to anyone who suffers on both sides, and that's what we need to do. I mean, we need to, we can't be one-sided about it. That's the way I look at it. So
I agree.